Today's episode is brought to you by the University of Hawaii College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources and the Livestock Extension Group.
Aloha, everyone, and welcome to the Livestock Wala'au, a podcast aimed to provide educational support, information, guidance, and outreach to our livestock stakeholders in Hawaii. We are your hosts, Mele Oshiro and
Shannon Sam.
Today, we're going to discuss the effects of the pandemic on our livestock industry in the West. And to do this, we're going to introduce you to the Director and Senior Economist for the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Katelyn McCullock.
I'm very excited to introduce you to Katelyn from the LMIC. Katelyn and I first met, I think it was like 5 to 7 years ago at a technical advisory committee meeting for LMIC, if I recall correctly. I don't know. It was a while ago. It's like, Katelyn has expertise in the areas of cattle, hog, dairy, hay, and grain sectors. Basically, you name it, she has a good idea what's going on. She has a variety of publications covering things like market analysis, research, and outlook. She has been a frequent presenter on national and regional levels, as well as through rural media outlets.
Yeah, Katelyn, Shannon's told me so much about what you do and such a great resource, I think, for our ag industry and a busy one, giving all those presentations and whatnot. So she shared some about what you do with the Livestock Marketing Information Center, but maybe you can just share a little bit more about it and how you came to be in your current position.
Sure. Well, thank you all very much for having me. I'm excited to talk to some Hawaiians. I haven't done that audience anytime recently or probably maybe ever in the past. So I appreciate the opportunity. So the Livestock Marketing Information Center has been around since 1955, and it started as a cooperative grant through USDA ERS and has over the last, I guess, close to 60 years, expanded to include most of the Western states, as well as other USDA agencies, and we call them associates, but it's other industry associations. So what we are is we are a virtual center of excellence, and we have a website where we interact in a variety of data platforms, mostly with USDA data, but we're also a membership group, which includes 28 land-grant universities, 13 associate members and 8 USDA agencies. And so it's a little bit of a unique group, but we're fairly unique, and we're primarily focused on livestock marketing information. So we do things like give presentations, we have forecasts, we write a lot of market analysis, and try and push those out to folks like you that are looking for that type of information.
Can you share with us a little bit about how that market impacts that are occurring in the mainland states kind of affect, I guess, our local livestock markets here and cattle prices and such? You know, about 90% of our cattle, especially in the state, do get exported outside of the state, and some folks retain ownership, some don't. So, you know, what can folks look at or expect, right, when things change in the mainland, and how is that going to impact those animals that they're trying to sell?
Well, that's a big question. And part of it is because over the last couple of years, we've had such large events overshadow markets that, you know, in a typical year, I might be talking about fairly smaller, microeconomies of corn in certain regions or hay or drought. But in 2019, especially for the cattle industry, we started with that huge fire at a slaughter plant, which caused a lot of disruption. And then for 6 months later, we had COVID-19, which had its own set of events. And now this year, we're still dealing with some lingering impacts from COVID-19, but we're also dealing with things like drought, extremely high feed costs, and things like that. So it's difficult maybe to tease out one thing versus another, but I like to group them into a couple of areas. When we think about the pandemic and what sort of impacts were there were shorter term impacts when we had things like labor shortages and the plants just could not operate, even though there were plenty of cattle, hogs, chickens available. You saw that slowdown and that disruption. You saw that bottleneck happen at the slaughter facility. And I don't know about your grocery stores, but our shelves got bare, and then we kind of had weird stuff where you'd be able to buy some things one week, other things.
We're still there sometimes, to be honest, here. So I don't know about Mele where you are over there, but I was like over here, like sometimes it's still pretty difficult. So we've had lots of shipping issues.
And so the logistical impact, which is not something we typically cover, has been one of those lingering things. Now, maybe we don't see those shortages quite as much as the grocery store, but things like cold storage were affected, where you're wondering what the capacity is in those areas. And we're still dealing with some lingering labor impacts. If you look at, the slaughter levels across the species, they haven't quite maxed to previous numbers. And a lot of that, you're still dealing with absenteeism, a little bit of maybe reluctance to come back to those slaughter plants and work those shifts as we saw in the past. And I don't know how quickly that aspect will be resolved, but it's one that's really difficult to monitor from at least from a livestock economist perspective. Another thing I'd like to kind of, sorry if I can keep talking here.
Keep going. Yep.
Is the demand side of things. So demand, we don't have a great measure for how much people are eating beef or chicken or pork. It's something we calculate after the fact. And during COVID, we had this huge surge in people coming to the grocery store and buying a lot of meat. We saw shortages of things like freezers, where people just wanted to.
You couldn't get them here to save your life for a little while there.
You still can't. If your refrigerator or freezer goes out now, you're waiting at least 2 months for something, and it might be there, but it's just limited on how they're going to get that freezer out to you. So
and we're still dealing with that too. Like appliances are not easy to find, or at least maybe the model you want. And so then you had this lull, though. Everyone's freezer was full. You had plenty of meat. You're cooking at home, and now this year we've seen a lot more demand for restaurant style cuts. So if you think about, a lot of times as an economist, I think about beef, chicken, pork, but really when you're a consumer, you're thinking about steak, ground product, chicken wings versus chicken breast, hams, etc. So it's not one thing. And those all have their own demand and supply changes as well. And some of those are more preferred by restaurants, or maybe we prefer them, I should say, when we go out to eat. And so restaurant pipeline refilling has been one of those big topics we've talked about that is a little bit harder to see, and maybe the bigger data points that we sometimes look at, because it's such a specific cut and things like that.
Well, and there's only so many of those cuts on whatever animal it is, whether that's I feel like chicken breast or chicken wings is a good example. If you're going to a restaurant, if you want wings or chicken breast or a steak or whatever. And is that related to the fact that we can I say depending on where you're at, travel again? Because I feel like we've definitely had a lot of tourism come back here, and in what I would consider, I've been told in Mele, you can correct me, but we have some of the highest tourist numbers we've had, especially on Big Island where we're at. In I think ever or years, it seems like there was a lot of people at the airport. Is all I know. So,
our numbers are a lot higher, and they're saying that than normal visitation, even pre-pandemic. So,
and I think that does play a role. Particularly when you think about portions, or at least, and this might not be true for everyone, but when I cook a steak at home, I might only eat half, or my husband and I will split it. When we go to a restaurant, I'm ordering a steak that's much larger than probably I would be cooking, and I'm not taking much home. Let's put it that way. But, and two, where you're going, what types of hospitality you're engaging in, because it's not just travel and tourism. If you think about all the business travel that had conferences that would serve a lot of particular meat cuts at luncheons versus dinners, all those types of events have yet to come back. And one of the ones we are seeing, though, is personal travel. I was in the airport the other day, and it was a lot less business travel for a Monday than maybe I would have seen 2 years ago. And so I think folks are excited to get out there, and we're seeing a little pent up demand there. The big question is, are we really going to see that continue? Does that have a lasting impact through the rest of 2021 as well as next year?
Right.
And beef is probably a little more heavily, and lamb is more heavily tied to that restaurant sector. And so we see that consumption move around a little bit more than chicken or pork. And so you could have different effects there too, depending on how much we're switching back and forth between restaurants and at home. I know that I really enjoyed some of the savings I got from not going out to eat so much, but I've very quickly gone back to my old ways of not wanting to cook very often.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when you get busy, it's hard not to want to just go and get something before you head home. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's nice to have the convenience factor again, to be honest. So,
yeah. You talk so much about the pandemic, right? And what you see happening over the next, couple of years, to foresee for the livestock industry as a whole, over the next few years. And I don't know what is your take on things and seeing how things are right now? I mean, the other thing going on, I know, is the drought, right? The drought is another huge impact that's influencing the livestock industry right now,
especially in the West.
Yeah, and I mean, it's occurring here too. We've been in drought now. As I say that, it's been raining for the past week, but it's still
it's different to be in a drought here than it is in other places.
Yeah,
and
definitely. But maybe you can share a little bit about that with us.
Well, let me take the marketing forecast question first, and then then we can come back to the drought one, and you can remind me. But so one of the things we are looking at right now is that COVID's still in the back of our mind, but I think we've learned a lot as the US, we've learned a lot across the world about different supply chain pinch points and things we can do differently. And so even with a resurgence, I'm not expecting quite the same sharp reaction that we saw last spring. I just don't see that happening now. Obviously, I can be wrong. Last year I was wrong a lot as we tried to chase these numbers through the pandemic.
We were all wrong a lot last year. It wasn't just you. I was like, no one could have predicted the what I would call the great TP shortage of 2020. Some people just had stockpiles of stuff, and some people you couldn't find it. So
But the couple of things I would keep in mind that are going to be longer term trend implications is that even before the pandemic, the beef cattle cycle was in a decline. And we saw in last week's report, or I'm sorry, in the July inventory report, that beef cow numbers are continuing to fade, largely because of some of that drought implication that you mentioned. But that's going to really challenge cattle supplies moving forward. And our price projections for cattle prices, both on the fed side and feeder side, are to continue to increase over the next 2 to 3 years. Probably somewhere close to 5% on the low end, and moving up higher from there, depending on kind of how bad this drought continues to weigh on that cow herd. Now, if you look at the hog side, we also saw a reduction in sow numbers in the last hogs and pigs report. And so both of those are pointing towards tighter supplies moving forward. That should be rather supportive of those live animal prices. On the chicken side, we've seen that production system can change a lot faster. And so you're talking more in weeks, and they're going to adjust based on profitability, as they know more about feed costs and demand. That's going to change much faster than those other two industries. And what they're looking at right now is how this crop has developed, how it is going to develop, and what sort of profitable margins they're looking at moving forward. And so all of those things are going to feed into how producers can make money, what sort of implications are there at the wholesale level. Now, we've talked already about demand. As those baseline costs go up, a lot of that's going to be passed on to the consumer. In the news, there's been some talk about inflation. And so you could see a pullback on the consumer level from a price standpoint, but we don't know necessarily how big that's going to be or how large that inflationary pressure is going to get. But from a strictly supply fundamental standpoint, we are probably looking at higher prices for the next 2 to 3 years on beef, and definitely the next year or so on pork. On the drought side, as Melly mentioned, the West is very, very dry. You are seeing hay prices in particular escalate to levels seen closer to that 2011-12 drought. We may have eclipsed some of those in certain areas. I mean, you have to remember, hay is such a regional crop. It's not going to get transported long distances. And so it becomes very difficult when you're extremely short to do much about it. Now, if you're talking about dairies, maybe you can substitute away some of that. But the truth is, all feed costs have really come up this year. And so that's that's been the struggle for a lot of these businesses, as how quickly they've escalated. And how that's wearing on those numbers. We've already seen quite a bit of beef cow slaughter come out of the western states. A lot of the forage grazing capacity in California was not really existent this year. A lot of those animals already had to move on. And it's something we're continuing to watch. Now, the cattle inventory report suggested that the beef cow numbers were down about 2%. That's a pretty big decline for the July 1 number. We'll get another estimate on January 1, but the calf crop was estimated to only be slightly below a year ago. I would expect that to be a little bit larger based on that beef cow number when we finally get the full year tally.
Very good. Well, that sounds like it's actually good news for beef producers and pork producers over the next year or so. If nothing else, the price is up a little, but with everything going on, who knows how expensive it is to feed them out is kind of what I take away from it. So
right. Yes.
So tell us a little bit about the export market, Katelyn.
Yeah.
As we talk about the US coming out of the pandemic and all of these changes to tourism and eating patterns change, that's also happening all over the world. All these other countries are experiencing their own reopening and coming to terms with their new normal, et cetera. They may also be dealing with different resurgences and how their vaccine programs are going. And one of the things that's been a real bright spot this year has been the export market for US, particularly beef, has been really strong. So USDA has released numbers through May at the time of this recording, and we are up about 18%.
Oh, that's really, really good. Wow.
Beef and veal exports on a carcass weight. Pork is about even with a year ago. Now, that might not sound that exciting, but last year we had a record high pork export number. And so for us to maintain that is excellent. And so it's been interesting to watch different countries' consuming patterns and those changes. Now, before COVID, we were talking about African swine fever in China, and that was one of the big market drivers on the pork side. That too had a resurgence during some of these timeframes, and their protein demand has continued to climb as those impacts have been felt by the country in different times in different ways. And so for us to maintain that record high level, not only to China, but also to continue to increase to other countries, is a huge boom for US exports of pork and beef. Beef too has been a big ticket item for Chinese, for the Chinese to import, and they are very quickly outpacing some of our key markets already.
Oh, wow. That's really good.
So I guess another question I think a lot of people come and ask about, I guess, is how to prepare, right, for future market upsets or changes similar to something that happened in a pandemic. I mean, we hope we don't ever have to deal with something that extreme again. But for, folks in smaller markets like us here, like I said, most of our cattle is exported, but everything here, all the other smaller livestock typically stay here. So what kind of advice or where resources that you folks provide that folks can go to try and kind of, prepare themselves for different markets or things that they can look at as far as their market for their animals and their prices, I guess, to say,
finding
and
prices
budget
tend to be one of the harder things for folks to do around here. So, yeah.
So we typically follow mostly USDA Agricultural Marketing Service prices. And so they cover all the major markets in the US. And you can see that regionally, different states, or even some of the bigger livestock states, you can even see smaller auctions than that they cover. So it depends on what you're looking for. It is very difficult to prepare for a black swan event because it's usually not something you can see coming, and the impact is just so great. It's very difficult to plan ahead for. The things that we probably tend to talk about more are the more regular sort of problems you might have, like drought or, having, risk management that you can use to try and mitigate increasing feed costs, which quite frankly, in the latest run-up probably only helped you for so long because that time period went longer than maybe you would have locked in for. And so some of these things are very hard to protect against. I think the best thing you can do is kind of try and think through some of those scenarios. What would you do if if this and this happen? Are there things you can do, like have more hay on hand than normal, or retain ownership if it looks like it's going to pencil out? And just going through that thought process. It doesn't mean necessarily you're going to practice the same things every single year, but I think those are all good, at least pen and paper type of exercises for producers to know whether their break-even costs are, what it's going to take. I guess some of the logistical things that have happened in the last 2 years are, again, very difficult to figure out. And that's where I guess I sit back and wonder, I don't know necessarily how you combat some of those things. The pandemic has brought up a lot of policy questions about the number of slaughter plants we have and where they're located, and how do we make sure that that flow of product maintains. And
the continuous.
And some of those are still being debated, and so there may be solutions that come out of this that help some of those situations, so you wouldn't have quite the disruption that you did. The US is very much built on a just-in-time system where delivery and case ready is a big part of that market, and switching gears was not possible or easy depending on the commodity. If you look at the dairy industry,
I mean, especially with consolidation and vertical integration of the different, like, depending on the protein market you're talking about, like, I mean, I think it's brought up a lot of interesting questions, and like just things that, like, you can, like, if you've got people hanging around kind of like this, I was like, we could just talk. I feel like I could talk about that for hours. So I was like, you can ask Melly, we've done it. I was like, because it is just one of those things that, like, this is how it's been set up, and it's kind of evolved over time, and like it's just so interesting to see how things have, like, changed, or like perspectives, I would say, potentially have shifted a little over the last year and a half or so.
And a lot of those changes require large investments. These supply chains weren't built overnight, and the changes to them will also not be built overnight.
No,
it's very expensive to build a new slaughter plant. It's expensive to change the way you do business when you're well set up for how it used to be. So those can be difficult questions to answer, and sometimes painful processes to adjust as well.
We talked a lot about just, like, I know we're mostly talking about grain-fed animals here, but can you talk any about the grass-finished market and beef cattle in your state?
Because we get this question too. Unfortunately, there's not that much data out there. And we specifically focus on more commodity type products, in part because that's where all the data is. And so I don't have a great handle on maybe, what those premiums are like, or how much production we have in those. But the consumer seems to be moving. COVID was a little bit of blip in this march towards knowing more about food and caring more about things like raising practices and non-carcass merits and things like that. I don't think COVID changed it as much as maybe interrupted it for a little while. And we're seeing a return to wanting to know more about food and animals, and where they're come from, and how they're raised, how they're harvested, etc. And I think the grass-fed market is well positioned to capitalize on some of that. I just visited New England last week, and that is an area where they do quite a bit of that grass-fed product. And sometimes I think it's difficult to see those markets in supermarkets as much, but if you look at specialty food stores and things like that, Whole Foods offers a variety of different raising practices in their stores as well.
And I think that's where a lot of ours is. Well, we don't even have a Whole Foods on our island, but it is on 2 of the other islands in the state. And majority of the grass-fed, I know there's a few producers here that follow different protocols so they can be into that market. But I think that's the important thing, and I don't think consumers understand the real reason why grass finish is a little bit more expensive. When you go in there, you're a family, you're trying to feed your family, you're going to choose one over the other, and typically the price is what dictates that.
And do you see that changing as commodity beef becomes more expensive?
I see what I've noticed, I think during the pandemic was a lot of folks reached out I think to just the local processors. I think they opened their mind and realizing, there's a local source here of beef that we can get, or even other proteins, and that's where folks went. I mean, we buy, from going to the folks that were at the farmers market or whatnot. And I don't think those other consumers had really thought about, you just typically go to the grocery store and get it, and then when they couldn't, then they had to kind of think of outside of that box of where else are we going to get our beef, or where else are we going to get our pork. And then that's kind of opened up some of the other markets, I think, kind of for other folks that were selling locally. So
yeah,
they now all still have big freezers too to fill, so they can
exactly
buy direct maybe.
Well, I mean, I know an interesting thing here is we do have we have quite a small slaughter processing capacity in the islands, because I only know of the ones here on Oahu. That's all we do. Are there any on USDA
there's
certified on Maui?
Yeah,
it's pretty minimal processing capacity here, which is a lot of the reason that they also end up shipped off, as well as it's it's a lot less expensive to feed them out that way too.
Yeah, I mean, there are two others. I think there's one on Kauai, and there's one in Molokai. And then of course there's Maui, but they're, like you said, the capacity is smaller. Our island is the only one that I think has 2 USDA certified slaughter units. And then we do have the mobile slaughter unit, but that's under a co-op. And that does not have a breakdown or processing fabrication unit. So they only take it to a quarter at the most, and that's it. So, and then our other one is the other big one's on Oahu. So, but 2 of our units, one on the Big Island and the other one on Oahu, are just recently got purchased by a new owner. So they're anticipating to expand capacity, and they want to. So that we're hoping that that'll help our grass finish market here, and those folks that are in that avenue to be able to have those slaughter dates that they want and whatnot. So the idea is try to keep more of our beef and animals here in the state but I don't know if we'll ever reach that point. We'll still be exporting a lot, I think.
We've seen a lot of interest in expanding existing facilities as well. And there's quite a few planned that are going to add capacity to current plants. And I think there's a couple of new ones that are being talked about. Some of them are more smaller and regional, but I think more capacity is heading our way. But that timeline is probably mostly next year.
Yeah, because I was over the last, I mean, I don't know how much people realize, but over the last, I would say decade or 2, I was there was a contraction in terms of, not in terms of the amount that could be processed, but just in terms of where it's located and stuff. And so, I mean, you spoke about, Katelyn, that was a big part of the bottlenecks, is when we had outbreaks and stuff, they had to shut down to clean or whatever. Cause I know when I lived in South Dakota, I know Sioux Falls had a couple of different outbreaks at their large pork processing facility. And so they were shut down quite a bit, depending, when everything was rolling through. So I mean, I think that is an interesting discussion to be had. So, yeah.
And even after they came up, were they limited as well on amount of workers, right, in a certain area? Because now they had to have a certain amount of space between them, or screens or whatever, that I'm sure that limited the amount of workers that they're able to have, and that limits the amount of animals or numbers they can push through at a daily rate as pre-pandemic numbers, right?
The big changes we saw, and you're absolutely right, the spacing and personal protective, I don't know if you want to call them fixtures, but also PPE were included in that, happened on the fabrication floor. And so you saw that slow down significantly how they broke down those carcasses. That was one of the reasons wings got so expensive, was the breaking down of those wings from the chicken itself was more difficult to do. Now, in general, poultry plants are a little more automated, have a little bit less hands-on than cattle and hog plants. But all of those things where it requires a lot of workers working on the line and dividing and fabricating that carcass or that primal into cuts, became significantly slower. And you saw that in some of the meat pricing data.
Yeah. Do you have any other exciting news that you think might be coming down the pipeline? I was like, I'm just excited to hear that prices are probably going to be pretty good for most of them. So
Yeah.
No, I think it's not often you would say, but you almost hope for a less exciting 2022, right?
Yeah.
I hope so.
Even though 2021 was definitely better than 2020, we still, at least for the first half of the year, we're dealing with quite a few unknowns, still some ripple effects, some shortages, or maybe not shortages is the right word, but bottlenecks, etc. And I'm thinking by the end of 2021, almost all of those things will have calmed down significantly to the point where maybe we aren't talking about them every outlook presentation and things like that. Not that maybe they'll be gone.
Yeah.
But that most of what we're going to be focused on, and I think this drought is going to overshadow a lot of marketing conversations next year. A 2% decline in beef cows is quite a bit. And that means that by 2022, you're going to have significantly smaller cattle supplies out there.
And it takes longer to build a cow herd back up than it does for hogs or poultry, because poultry, is it 6 to 8 weeks from like hatching to like processing, and then hogs are, I want to say somewhere between 6 months and a year, depending on your product you're doing. And then cattle are anywhere from 18 to 24 months. So it's a much longer cycle in terms of building out that like capacity again. So
and especially when you have a liquidation that's forced by drought, all of a sudden when things turn around, those replacement heifers get very expensive. And it can be difficult to buy back in. And so there's some of the, I don't know what the perfect strategy is, but something to think about in the back of producers' minds is how you might want to increase your cow herd when the time's right, and how quickly maybe you can do that.
Yeah. How do you keep those replacement heifers through a drought and things that you like hold on to as much as you can for when the good times come back around?
Yeah.
That's kind of the hard thing to plan for, though, with droughts and weather and like just everything. So
yeah, it's not something you can always predict, right? So well, thank you so much, Katelyn, for joining us today and sharing your expertise with us. We really appreciate it. Taking that time out of your schedule, because I know you're a very busy lady.
Yes, thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for having me. I'll give my shameless plug. We do have new market commentary every 2 weeks on the lmic.info website.
Oh, good.
If your listeners ever want to check it out, it's every 2 weeks that we do a new newsletter, but that's free on the front page if anyone ever wanted to take a look at what we're discussing.
One day we'll see if we can get you over to Hawaii to do something with our outlook and whatnot in our markets here. It would be really good.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Make sure to join our Facebook page, the Livestock Extension Group, if you haven't already. Be sure to visit the UHCTAR Extension website and our YouTube channel listed in the show notes.
For additional information about this topic, see LMIC and the UHCTAR website listed in our show notes of the podcast and the description box on our YouTube page. Thanks again, everyone, for listening to the Livestock Wala'au.
Before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast. That's us, by the way, by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts and anywhere you listen to this. Then stay tuned for next month's podcast.
Ahui ho, everybody.
Mahalo.
Thanks for tuning in.